Yeah. Thank you. Right. Sorry, I've had to do some weird stuff with IT because anything else would have been too easy. But welcome everybody. Thank you all very, very much for coming to the first ever salon at Stowe. How this is going to work, well, we'll find out once we start, I think. But a few things before we go. First of all, a huge thanks to Harry Bryan, who has offered to come in and essentially be your voice, if you like, on this, asking the questions that hopefully you will want to hear. Thank you all also for coming. I really, really appreciate that. I know it's very, very late. And we'll try to make sure that all of this goes as well as it possibly can. Before we get on with anything else, I'd just like to read a brief statement on behalf of the Sixth Form Centre and the salon at Stowe. And I hope you'll all understand exactly why I'm doing this. So, Salon at Stowe stands on the premise that knowledge is always a good thing, and therefore more knowledge is better. It is not about pushing one ideology over another, or an attempt to add to the distressingly large amount of prejudice and ill-informed outrage that infects so much of what used to be called polite conversation and political discourse. It is precisely because these issues are important and emotive that we must explore what they mean. If we are going to understand each other, that can only be achieved by pushing back against idiocy and bigotry. I understand that in the course of this, we will discuss many intensely sensitive issues, but I reject the premise that for that very reason, we should not discuss those ideas. Doing so would be to let ignorance hide in darkness, a darkness in which misunderstanding festers and that always ends in bad things. Once upon a time, we used to be able to discuss emotive and even controversial topics without descending into polemic or rancor. And if we are going to make sense of an increasingly complex world, we need to rediscover that ability. From which it follows that anybody who is not able to conduct this proceeding in a civilized and polite manner will immediately be asked to leave. I hope that's all clear. Brilliant. Well, once again, thank you very much for coming along this evening. We'll see how this works. You know, this is all about this exchange of ideas, about discussions, but it's probably going to be led quite a bit from the front this evening. So without further ado, Harry, do you want to take it on?
Yeah, thanks for turning up, everyone. So I think to start, I think it's very obvious. The biggest and most basic question is why is Russia so interested in Ukraine, and therefore what reason would it have to invade, or why would it want to invade?
Right. Okay. Again, very good place to start. Let's begin at the beginning. Stop that. Let's go back here. Sorry about this. I will get all of this set up for next time. So I don't plan on doing an awful lot of chalk and talk, and I should have said from the outset that I am far from an expert in this particular matter, okay? This is all about research and about looking things up. So, what is Russia's interest in Ukraine? Well, let's start off. Why is it doing that? Damn bloody internet. Right, we're going to get there in a second. What I've had to do is, because I can't project onto the screen, I've had to record a video. Let's see if that is going to, for goodness sake, come on. Right, okay. Now, in theory, what that should be showing you is a whopping great map, a map of Ukraine. In case you didn't know, Ukraine is absolutely massive. That's not a technical phrase, but Ukraine is absolutely enormous. And there it is there. So, not only is Ukraine, I did spend hours wrestling with the, so there we go. So there we go, that's Ukraine. And it's a very bad picture, but it's bordered on three sides by, well, sort of got Russia over there on the right. We've got Belarus above it. We've got Poland to the left, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and Moldova all snuck in there. So it's a huge country. But let's also look at that bit on the right, the bit that's blue. Now, the bits that's blue there are those areas that identified to a certain or less, to a greater or lesser extent, as being Russian, or certainly as having Russian as their native language. So what we're looking at there is a very, very complicated political picture. Now, Ukraine, as of course I'm sure you all know, was part of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union dissolved remarkably peacefully back in the mid-90s, Ukraine was able to go off to a certain extent independent of Russia. But that has always caused a degree of, well, let's call it issues. Let's see if this goes. So I think in terms of strategic influence, it's fairly clear there that Russia has a massive strategic interest in Ukraine. It's a gateway to the west. It also controls an awful lot of warm weather ports. Russia, obviously, to the north and to the east. The sea there it's frozen a lot of the year, so you don't really have access to warm water. Less of an issue nowadays that submarines can go in and out of the Baltic, but nevertheless still significant. It is also that cultural element. The cultural element is very significant. If you're interested, on the 12th of July, 2021, somebody called Vladimir Putin posted an essay on nkremlin.ru on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. I'll spare you all of the 6,885 words and read you the penultimate two paragraphs. I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. Our spiritual, human, and civilizational ties formed for centuries and have their origins in the same sources. They've been hardened by common trails, achievements, and victories. Our kinship has been transmitted from generation to generation. It is in the hearts and the memories of people living in modern Russia and Ukraine, in the blood ties that unite millions of our families. Together we have always been and will always be many times stronger and more successful, for we are one people. Today these words may be perceived by some people with hostility. They can be interpreted in many possible ways. Yet many people will hear me, and I will say one thing: Russia has never been and will never be anti-Ukraine. And what Ukraine will be is up for its citizens to decide. Now, that was written back in July of 21, so in other words, midway through last year. And to a certain extent, that sums up certainly Russia's attitude towards Ukraine. So in terms of why Russia might be interested in Ukraine, we can see that there's strategic reasons, there's cultural reasons, and indeed there are historical reasons.
I think it's also probably worth noting, if I can just interject there, that Gorbachev, one of the sort of leaders of the USSR, his mother was Ukrainian. So I think it's worth noting that not only does Putin feel that the Ukrainians are a sort of part of Russia, Gorbachev's mother was Russian, so Gorbachev himself was Gorbachev's mother was Ukrainian. So therefore, he was half Ukrainian. So therefore, I think Putin's sort of political agenda of perhaps reuniting the USSR, if you could call it that, I think it all sort of stems in from Gorbachev's sort of Ukrainian roots and heritage, really.
Well, it goes all the way through. Let's not forget that Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine, has Russian as his first language. So it's a very, very complicated situation with many, many overlapping areas of interest and conflict.
Perfect. So moving on then, we've seen that Russia's posted several demands to NATO, to name a few, a sort of Ukrainian ban on ex-Soviet nations joining NATO, sort of limiting the deployment of troops and weapons to NATO's eastern flank and the sort of Baltic states. But what does Putin really want on the grander sort of international relations, on the sort of world stage? What does he want with Ukraine?
Okay, I think it's a big complicated question. Basically, Russia, as it says that, what does Putin really want? Well, the only person who can really answer that question is Putin. And it doesn't matter how much you read, how much you listen. All of the foreign analysts, all of the apparatchiks you want to talk to, they all say the only person who can answer this question is Putin. But let's see if we can try to get a little bit of clarity. And again, what we'll do is we'll divide and rule. Let's have a look at, this is his official stance, that he doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO. I think we can stop that straight away, because Ukraine was never going to join NATO. When NATO expanded over the various years, we got to about 2008. And in 2008, there was an agreement that Ukraine was going to serve to sign. What exactly was it? A membership action plan. A membership action plan was lined up for Ukraine, but it was never going to be signed. NATO had very little interest in extending it to Ukraine. The Germans, for a start, wouldn't have it. The French were very unhappy about it. And of course, Russia made its opposition to any sort of NATO involvement in Ukraine immediately obvious from the start. So NATO was never going to be part of Ukraine. Now, the really interesting thing at this point was that, to a certain extent, the West was in a strange position. You know, we, as far as we were concerned, and I'm very much aware of the sensitivities of many of those in the audience, as far as we were concerned, we'd won. You know, we'd won the Cold War. And Russia seemed to be descending into some sort of disarray. The satellite states had been spun off. They were all joining the EU. We had a Western expansion, certainly, of, I have to be careful about, but, you know, in terms of the expansion of NATO, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined in 1999. And then in 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And then Albania and Croatia in 2009. So we thought we'd won. And at no point did we ever think that NATO would be forced to fight a land battle in Europe. And so what NATO was at that point was some sort of extension of the EU, offering military assistance and training and support. We didn't really, you might call it complacency, you might call it naivety, but NATO at that point wasn't an army, essentially. It was more, if we think, certainly in terms of European deployment, it was a form of military consultancy. It was a massive military consultancy. And so that's effectively what NATO was. Now, why is NATO no longer that? Well, because of Georgia and because of the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And suddenly NATO is having to gear up and start to look like an army again. And that's complicated because we're not entirely sure how we're going to fight over here. But in terms of the bigger picture, let's just see if we can look at this. You know, what is Putin really worried about? What Putin is worried about is NATO drifting westwards. So it's about Ukraine drifting westwards. It's not about the eastward expansion of the EU and the things that I was talking about earlier, where all of these people, where all these satellite states were joining NATO and the EU. That's not the EU going out that way. It's those countries coming towards the EU, seeking the stability and prosperity that the EU seems to offer. And what Putin desperately wants to avoid is to have a bastion of democratic liberalism and capitalism sitting right on his southern flank. Absolutely. And so he's very, very keen to destabilize that at every point. And that is exactly what he's been doing since 2014 and indeed before. And you can understand why he would do it. I mean, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but we are not averse, us in the West. We've been more than happy to meddle in other countries' business. So why should we be able to do it and Putin not? Now, there's all sorts of reasons why we can go into that in much, much more detail. But let's be clear that the West has form here.
Yeah, wonderful. Moving on a bit further, then, what would be? Let's just pretend that Putin did invade Ukraine. What would be the sort of consequences for Europe and maybe the rest of the world of a Russian invasion and potential annexation of Ukraine?
Okay, now that is a very good and a very, very important question. And again, I think that in order to answer it, we need to divide it up a little bit. And so what I've done is I've thought about the military consequences, the economic consequences, and the political consequences. Now, in terms of the military, I know you've got probably more information on this than me. So why don't I flip that one back to you? Tell us what the military consequences are going to be.
Well, I think, to be honest, I think to start we should probably consider, could Putin invade if he wanted? And I think the simple answer is he could invade. A separate question to that would be whether the invasion would be successful, but he can invade. I mean, you look at the statistics, he's got sort of over 100,000 troops on the border. He's got sort of main battle tanks, artillery, infantry fighting vehicles. He's got all sorts massed up on the border, ready to invade if he wants to. Russia's got superiority in both the air and on the ground, and has had far more experience than Ukraine in fighting combined armed operations. They did it in Syria not so long ago. And I think so long as there's no sort of international interference, it could probably keep going until its objectives, the Putin's and the Kremlin's objectives, matched in line with the military objectives. So I think they could. There's also signs of a potential invasion. I mean, there's been ideological preparation of the population since 2014. So prior to the annexation of Crimea, Putin sent out a bunch of propaganda to his population justifying an invasion. And this has been going on. I mean, you mentioned the essay written by Putin back in July 2021, and this was made compulsory reading for all of his military forces. So clearly there is the preparation going on. On top of this, the Russian defense minister posted a claim on the Kremlin's website that US mercenaries are preparing a provocation with chemical weapons, which potentially is Russians preparing and setting up a basis for an invasion. So they certainly could. I think we'll probably get onto how successful an invasion would be in a minute, but they can do. I think the military consequences of that for the West is that sort of that buffer zone between the West and the sort of Russia, who in the West eyes is quite a threat. It would grow. I mean, if Russia did invade, it would increase the manpower of the United States. It would increase their natural resources and generally broaden their basis as a threat to the West. So I think that'd be the main military threat, is this growing of an international threat on par with perhaps China and Iran. So those are probably the big military consequences.
I'll just add a little bit to that, if I may. This is not the first time that Russia has sent troops to the Ukrainian border. It's a fairly regular thing. This is different in terms of two things. First of all, in terms of the scale. You know, you're looking at somewhere between 110 and 120, 130,000 people. But also, you've got what they call the teeth and the tail. Has anyone come across this phrase before? No? Well, the teeth is the
fighting forces,
and the tail is the
logistical
support, right down to mobile blood supplies. Now, again, Putin has done this before. He has moved troops to the borders, not on this scale. We're looking at troops that have been moved from the Chinese border over there. Now, they can't stay there very long. You know, they're now positioned there. They're away from their logistics. They're away from their home bases. There's a time limit as to how long those characters can stay there. And it was interesting that, you know, while we see this on a regular basis, the reaction from the Western powers was very, very different this time. There was something different in the water. Now, I was talking with a friend of mine who knows about this, and he argued that one of the reasons perhaps why the response in Washington and London and elsewhere in Europe was so different was not necessarily because of the intelligence they were receiving, but perhaps because of the way in which each of those leaders was themselves in battle, and they therefore had to show some response. So this is where things get very, very confusing. The line that's often spouted is, you know, that Putin's bluffing. Well, no one knows. If he was going to invade, or if he were to invade, this is exactly what it would look like. So, unlike all of the other occasions when he has deployed forces, you know, this genuinely looks. This is indistinguishable from invasion planning. You've got troops in the north. You've got the mobile operations in Donbass, and you've got troops pulled in from all over the country. Okay, there's a hand, Nikita.
So do you think Russia will go for the whole Ukraine, or for some eastern parts of Ukraine, as those tend to be Russian-speaking? They'll be less rebellion, and most of the Mediterranean geography require putting the country, especially in the east, which makes it quite easy for the Russian tanks to go through.
Which bit do you want?
To be honest, I think we should start. I think you've slightly not jumped the gun here, but you forwarded on the conversation to could the Russians sustain an invasion, which is quite interesting.
Before we get on to that, let's just think about, so just to pull back on one point. Would they go for limited gains? I don't think so. And I don't think so for two reasons. Once those troops are in the ground, once those troops pile over the border, and to a certain extent, you're as well hung for a sheep as a lamb. So, I don't see why he would hold back. The second reason is that it's not just about the Donbass, it's the troops all the way through Belarus. If you were just going to take out the Donbass, then you could have your troops go in there, and that's already a disputed zone. I don't think you can have surgical strikes in the wider Ukraine without just piling in. I think I don't see why you would have 130,000 people around that border if you were just going for the little spots. And then, of course, you've got the bigger problem, which I think Harry was about to come on to. If you're going to go in and you're going to take these isolated spots, then how are you going to hold them? Because you're surrounded on all sides.
Yeah, so following on from that, I think quite an interesting question is whether regardless of whether Putin wants to take the whole country, whether he can or he can't. I mean, you break down a sort of a military invasion of Ukraine. There are several sort of factors that determine the success of the invasion. You've got to think about, at the moment, you've got to think about the weather in eastern Ukraine. You've got to think about the effect of urban contact in slowing down the advance. You've got to think about the command and control problems that may arise. And following on from that, logistics, and finally the morale. So to break it down a little, I mean, you look at the weather. So whilst at the moment, sort of a January-February invasion would be favourable to the Russians because, as you mentioned, there's frozen ground in the east of Ukraine. Russian tanks can quite simply roll over it with speed and effect. Also, there's a lack of sunlight at the moment. There's only about 8.5 hours a day, which benefits the night fighting capabilities of the Russians. So there's clearly some ticks there. But you take the other side. So in March, in eastern Ukraine, you've got to deal with, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this, but the Rasputitsa, the big thaw, the thaw in eastern Ukraine. So you've got to deal with that, which effectively turns all the frozen ground into a bog as the weather warms up and the snow melts. And this is huge. This is a huge issue for a mechanized advance. Trying to get tanks rolling through it and troops, it slows it down considerably. You also look at the effects of urban contracts. So as you mentioned again, eastern Ukraine is a really rural area, but also there are several major urban areas which, if they were defended properly, could take a long time to clear out. I mean, you look back at the first Chechen War of the 1990s. Russia's forces took over a month to take control of a town called Grozny, which was only protected by a few thousand troops. If that's going to slow down the advance that much, the sort of sanctions, the economic sanctions being pushed on by the international sphere, the sort of rate at which the advance continues will slow down and weaken the ability for an invasion to be successful. And you could argue on that point, miss out the urban areas. But these urban areas are key strategic logistical points for an invasion. You've got to have use of the roads, you've got to have use of the railways to sustain your troops if an invasion is to be successful. You can send your troops out all you like, but they can only get so far if they don't have resupplies of ammunition and all the rest of it. So you've got to have these urban centres, but they take time. I could keep going, but I think the point here is a Russian invasion, they've got the capability of invading, but will they be successful? I think it's a big question than that. It's far more complicated. And actually, I think the real thing is it would be really quite difficult. If the Ukrainians could put up a defense long enough, actually, whilst they might want to take the whole of Ukraine, could they? I think that's a different question because they may only get so far and then not be able to keep going any further because of the Ukrainian resistance and defense and their inability to keep going with an invasion.
I'm going to pick up on one point there that Harry raised, which was the Ukrainians themselves. Don't forget, the Ukrainians have got the third biggest army on mainland Europe. And if Russia decides to invade, the consequences for Russia are going to be significant. They're going to get tied into a bloody war of expansion. And it will be resisted by the Ukrainians. So maybe, and obviously the resistance is going to change from different areas, but it only needs a sufficient number to resist, and then that initial attack gets bogged down, and you're right back where we were in Afghanistan, and where the Russians were in Afghanistan back in '79 and onwards. Yeah. And I'm always reminded of a lovely phrase when Tony Blair was trying to sell the Iraq War to Jacques Chirac back in 2003. Now, Chirac, French president at the time, he was a lot older than Blair, and he had actually fought in the Franco-Algerian War. And Blair went in and he said, look, it's going to be amazing. We've got all these bombers, we've got lasers, we've got stuff. And Chirac turned around to Blair and looked him square in the eye and said, look, it doesn't matter how it starts. It always ends the same way, with soldiers with guns going door to door through an urban environment. At that point, Blair knew he'd lost the argument. He turned around and he walked out. And as he walked out, he said to his aide, the problem with Jacques, he just doesn't get it. Turns out the problem was that it was Blair that didn't get it. You can start with all the whiz-bangs you like, but it always ends with soldiers going door to door. And as soon as you do that, the costs mount up in terms of blood and treasure. And while Russia has resources of both, there's a limit to that. And defensive battles, when you're fighting back, when you're defending your homeland, it means a lot more to you than it means to somebody who's coming in trying to take it off you.
Yeah, I think just following on from that, picked up there. Morale is a big factor here. You look at Ukrainian morale, and they're fighting for their freedom from the Russians. Whether they want to have Russian occupation is a different question, but they're fighting for themselves. They're fighting for their nation. They're fighting for their homeland, as it were, and their morale is going to be a lot stronger than a Russian conscript who's been drafted into this battle, who's fighting off of the back of Putin's orders, really. It's weak. I mean, you've also got to consider that Russia's army is, of its ground forces, a third of its ground forces are made up of these one-year conscripts. So whilst we think of all these troops massing on the border, a lot of them are there just because they have to for a year's service and then they'll leave. They're not up for a big war. They're not there they're not there wanting to go invade Ukraine. They're just there if they're told to be there, and they'll go in if they're told to invade. And I think a resistance from the Ukrainians will be far stronger than we can imagine. I mean, there was a story in the news the other day of a Ukrainian grandmother who decided to buy a sniper rifle and said she would fight to the death and try and take out as many Russians as she could. That slightly sums up the Ukrainian morale. And Russian morale, is it there? Who knows?
I have one question. If Putin is ready to invade Ukraine fully, how can he call Ukrainians brothers to Russia if he's ready to fight that? Well, what is he fighting against?
Okay, maybe we can come back to that one in a bit. Okay, I think obviously Putin has a very clear idea of what Russia looks like, and it's not necessarily going to be the same as that idea of those in Ukraine and Belarus and elsewhere in Georgia. But let's push on. Just think about this one. The economic consequences of invasion are going to be material. The likely impact is the West will increase sanctions. Will we switch off the? I don't know if you know about this one. Let's see if I think it goes to this now. If I've got this one right. this is the Nordstream Pipeline, which you may have heard about. This isn't online yet. If Russia invades, then the Americans have said they will stop this. Quite how they're going to stop it, I'm not entirely sure. This is designed to feed gas to Western Europe, well, particularly to Germany, and that's one of the reasons why Germany has been very lukewarm in its response. But the answer is that the economic consequences are going to be significant. Now, we're going to keep buying Russian oil and we're going to keep buying Russian gas because that's what we do. We can't not do that. We bought Russian oil and gas all the way through the Cold War. So that's not going to change. What's likely to change is that other sanctions will be in place that may very well hit those allies of Putin who are using the West to get their cash out of Russia. And so if banks in the UK, if institutions in the UK start receiving Russian money, that's going to have a consequence in the longer term, in the medium term, because Putin is very, very powerful, yes, indeed, but I don't think we can assume that he is completely immune from pressure from the right place. So the economic consequences are going to be material. And the political consequences, similarly, I think, will be material because nothing unites people like a common enemy. So while at the minute, the West is in a state of some disarray, they are slowly coming together. Yes, the Germans are lukewarm because they're worried about Nord Stream. France, I don't know why Macron went to negotiate with Putin the other day. It didn't really help matters massively. But this will bring the West closer together. And so I think the consequences of any invasion would be vast. And we haven't even talked about the destabilizing influence that it would have in the immediate area around Ukraine and into Belarus and into Poland and those Moldovan states and so on. Because two things are going to happen then. First of all, you're going to have massive floods of refugees leaving the country. And obviously, we know how willing Europe is to accept refugees, so that's going to ramp up the political pressure. So you're going to have refugees coming out, and then coming in, you're going to have weapons, cash, whatever is required to fund and fuel the resistance movement. So I think the notion that Putin could come in and knock over Ukraine in a short amount of time is fundamentally misguided. And I think Putin knows that. He's many, many things, but he's not stupid.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think just something quickly to consider. So when we think about the economic sanctions, the fact that the Russian economy is smaller and more vulnerable than Italy's. So the longer an invasion would grind out, which it inevitably would with the challenges that an invasion faces, the economic sanctions would grow exponentially, and they would increase, and they would weaken Russia, and perhaps that might be the biggest factor for Russia, is that it would wreck its economy if the West imposed sanctions, if the international space imposed sanctions on it.
Yeah, I completely agree. You'll be pleased to hear.
That's good thing. Where are we now?
So we're now up to, I think, Crimea.
Yeah. So yeah, final question up on the big screen. So the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Why didn't Europe prevent the annexation? And therefore, what gives us reason to believe that they'll prevent or support prevent an annexation of Ukraine as a whole? How does that one fit into all this?
Okay. Sounds like a very complicated question, but there's basically two very simple answers. One is complacency, and the second is appeasement. Those of you who know your history will know all about the Sudetenland. I have to be careful because there are people who know more about history here than me. But I wonder if there's an analogy to be drawn there, in that Hitler made these arguments that the Sudetenland was basically natively German and strong cultural links, all the same things that Putin is saying about Ukraine. And so when Hitler invaded and took over the Sudetenland, we turned a blind eye because it was easier to do that. And at that time as well, back in 2014, the Russian military was not in a position to push on further. So that was contained. The Crimea was contained, and so again, by that combination, I think, of complacency and appeasement, we let it go. However, it's very, very important that we acknowledge that at the same time, while we didn't do anything militarily, we did impose sanctions, and those sanctions got increasingly severe over the following few years, to the extent that the Russian economy has shrunk by more than 10%. So while the rest of the world's economies have been growing, there's been a bit of retrenchment with COVID. Economies generally have been recovering from 2008 and whatnot, and what have you. But if you look at the Russian economy, it takes a massive dive in 2014, and then it takes another hit with COVID. So that's a combination of two things. Just so we're clear, it's the collapse in the oil price, and obviously it doesn't hurt Putin at the minute that the oil price is increasing. But the oil price collapsed, but the Russian economy was really, really hurt by that batch of sanctions. The irony is, even as those sanctions bit, even as the Russian economy contracted, in terms of popularity, the Russian support for the annexation of Crimea just grew more and more over the years, up to a point. And then when the economic sanctions really began to bite, that started to fall off again. So I think the answer to that is that we didn't want to get involved militarily. Don't forget, we were still just coming off the back of some really nasty engagements still there in Asia, and we weren't going to go to war in our own backyard. But we thought we didn't have to. And again, that combination of complacency and appeasement, with hindsight, it looks stupid. But then hindsight is always a precise science. And again, the sanctions really, really bit. This time it's different because the Russian military is different. The global situation is different. And this, the Russian preparation around Ukraine is again very, very different.
All right, so I'll hit you with one final question then. Do you think Russia would invade?
No, I don't. I don't honestly see what Putin will gain from invading. Essentially, what Putin does is he thrives on chaos. What Putin seeks to do is to create chaos amongst his enemies, because as his enemies get weaker, he perceives that he gets stronger. And that's exactly what he's done. He's put the cat amongst the pigeons. The Americans are having to reconsider their whole global strategy, because essentially they'd written Russia off. That's contained. Let's deal with China. But now, my God, we now have to redirect back towards the West. We saw the way that the Russians got involved in Brexit, the way they got involved in successive elections in the United States and in the UK. And by the way, let's be clear, it's not just the Russians that have done that. We've been doing that for years. Okay, we invented that. All of the color revolutions, all of the business in the Middle East with the various ousting thing. We and this is one of the things that really riles Putin, is that he looks at us as rank hypocrites, and he's got a point. But coming back to what does Putin want? Putin wants his enemies in disarray, and he has achieved that. Which brings us to what I think is a really, really interesting question. Having achieved essentially his aim, the oil price is up, the enemies have got no idea what to do. Biden looks weak and pathetic because he doesn't know whether he's looking at China or at the Soviet. All of Putin's goals have been achieved at absolute minimal cost. What he needs to do now is work out what his exit strategy is. How can he back down from this without loss of face? And that's going to be a tricky one. he has to do it as well because we've got those troops who've been drawn from the Chinese border. They need to go back. Apparently, he's very, very worried about upsetting President Xi. He doesn't want to intrude upon the Olympics because Sino-Russian relations now are stronger than they've been since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they're building bridges while we're disassembling theirs. So Putin has to find a way of getting out of this without losing face. And I think as soon as he works out what that is, we'll see him back down. I just don't see any situation where Russia invades Ukraine that leaves him stronger in the medium or long term. In terms of the get out clause, I think we've got big military operations coming up with Belarus. I can't remember what the name of it is, but I think that finishes on the 20th of February. And I suspect, I hope, that at that point, Putin will withdraw. Because again, think about this. If he withdraws at that point, everyone else is saying, well, what the hell was that about? So again, it's about sowing confusion. It's about getting your enemy on the wrong foot without even throwing a punch. But I just don't see how it works for Putin if he invades.
Perfect. That's ideal.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? Adora? Yeah.
Yeah, so, sir, do you think that, like, finally, both sides will find kind of like peaceful agreement to kind of like this between Russia and Ukraine?
Peaceful agreement. What do you think?
I think that potentially, between Ukraine and Russia, you say, in the long run, I think there'll always be some form of sort of unrest, some sort of social disturbance between Ukrainians Russians and Russians Ukrainians. How does that all go? In the long term, I think there will be. I think in the short term, I think people will just be thankful there wasn't an invasion, and I think they'll try and leave it at that and try and move past it. Well, I mean, that's British politics, isn't it? So I think long term there'll always be those long simmering tensions, but I think people will just be thankful there's sort of invasions being evaded, or let's touch wood, it invades.
So, Colin, let me pick up. What do you think?
Yeah. No, everything all right. Just thanks for your answer. Just in case, what do we consider as long term and short term?
Well, that's an interesting question. But let me come at it from a slightly different direction. Okay, it's not going to be like France and Germany in the short term. Okay, or even in the medium term, long term. But at the same time, it's not going to be like North and South Korea. So there I've established a massive sliding scale. It's going to be somewhere along that, and it's going to be that. Well, I suspect, as Harry describes, that peaceful coexistence. Now, I say peaceful coexistence. Let's not forget that since 2014, 14,000 people have died in the Donbass. So that's not massively peaceful. But just like every other instance around the world where this happens, that stops when and only when parents get sick of burying their children. That's the only time that stops. That's what happened in Northern Ireland. Hopefully at some point, that's what's going to happen in Jerusalem and in the Middle East. It's when parents get sick of burying their kids that they realize, hang on, that this is daft. You know, what exactly are we fighting for? If all that it ends with is parents standing by a grave, that's when this stops. It's not going to be the actions of great men. The great men of history theory is absolute nonsense at this point. These border disputes only really stop when people are sick of burying their children.
Right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Nikita, we've heard from you. We'll come back to your question in a minute. Fed.
I have just two questions. Do you believe that the US and UK armamentization of the Ukrainian military played a large part in what has now been a peaceful encounter between the Russian forces in the Ukrainian border?
Do I think it was a significant factor? No.
No?
Do I think it's a significant excuse? Yes.
And do you believe that the US and UK still have a moral intention and an economic benefit of supplying these weapons to Ukraine?
Well, I don't think you can apply any sort of moral compass to arms sales. There's nothing moral about it at all. It's driven by blatant self-interest. I suppose you could argue, no, you can't. I mean, basically, we're flogging guns. It's what we do. We're very good at it. We're the world's 5th largest arms exporter, or whatever it is. So if we weren't doing that, it would leave a massive hole in our economy. We're building a naval base for the Ukrainians, I believe, somewhere just around the corner from Crimea. So we might very well dress it up as a principled stand of arming our loyal brothers, and sisters. But fundamentally, it's driven by self-interest. And if, as we described earlier, if it does go sideways, and please, it doesn't, relative to what we've been putting in there, the amount of military that's just going to flood in from every side is just going to dwarf all of that. Because once you open the floodgates, the sort of the legitimate supplies kind of drain up, but they'll get in by other routes.
I understand.
Good. That's good.
You talk about Putin wanting to weaken his enemies.
Yeah.
What, is there a long-term plan for that, or is he just weakening them for?
Well, I'd be interested in what you think on this.
Why is he weakening his enemies? Is there a long-term plan? I suppose maybe Putin probably doesn't know himself what his long-term plan is. I mean, how can you sort of plan when everything's going on? I think, as you said, I think Putin thrives on chaos and bedlam of his rivals, and I think that's probably what his plan is just to keep going and keep messing with the West and keep the West on their toes. I think that's sort of all he's got, really. He can't do much else than just keep on causing chaos and
I think,
sitting still.
thanks, yeah, I would agree with that, but I'd actually go a little bit further and say that as far as Putin's concerned, he sees it as a zero-sum game. So in other words, if the other side is losing, he must be winning. And on top of that, he's not really brought much home to Russia in recent times. And so what he can do, what he can demonstrate is that the way in which he is able to play the West, like a cheap guitar, goes down extremely well at home, particularly when the economy is stagnating, when the economy is in appalling shape, when Russian disposable income is like bumping along the floor. Here you can say, look at the way I've got Biden dancing. I yanked my string, and there Biden, leaping around. And what has he done? Well, let's think about the Russian record over the last however many years. You've got Georgia, which is pretty terrible. You've got the annexation of the Crimea. You've got the 14,000 dead in Donbass. You've got a global assassination program where enemies of Russia are being bumped off with apparent immunity or impunity. And what he's done is he's changed the narrative. We're not talking about that anymore. We're talking about Crimea. And so, essentially, what Putin's done is he's changed the channel. He's got us talking about a NATO expansion that was never happening. He's got us worried about all sorts of things that just were never really on the agenda, and we're not looking at the other things that he's doing. And again, every time he unsettles us, every time he yanks on the string and Boris jumps up or whoever it is, that's a win as far as Putin's concerned. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So we obviously talk about the fact that Putin wants the chaos and feeling like he's winning over his enemies. Let's say that the war doesn't happen and it's sort of in maybe a few years' time, it's all sort of died off, and the chaos seems to have stopped, and his feeling of winning is over. Do you think it's possible we could see a similar sort of thing again to get this chaos factor, or would that be too obvious? We have to start looking at it in different ways?
I think it probably is a bit obvious, isn't it? I think he's caught the West off guard. We weren't expecting it really. He's suddenly massed all his troops. The West has gone into chaos. I'm sure there's hundreds of people working on hundreds of sort of different defensive plans and all the rest of it. He's caused all that, but if he did it again, it would be like the boy crying wolf. People would know what's good. People would be prepared for it. The West would know what they were doing. And the West would know what they're doing. The Ukrainians would know what they're doing. And his chance of success slim even further. And yes, he might get a bit of chaos from the West if he did it again. But I think it would diminish and diminish. He's done it once, and I don't see him really doing this again in the same place.
I'm glad you said that because I disagree with you completely. I don't see it as being possible. I see it as being inevitable. This is what he does. He sows chaos. Now, it might not be in the same place, but it's that thing. Well, he must mean it this time. He must mean. He can't be bluffing us again. Well, he can do because it's the madman theory. It's much like the North Korean position. He's just mad enough to do it. And he really means it. So we're completely on the back foot. We've got no idea what he's doing. And don't forget, I mean, this is again, we've got to think of this every now and again. You've got to see it from your opposition's perspective. He looks at what we've done. He looks at what we did in Iraq twice, in Afghanistan, in Kosovo. We redrew the map in Kosovo. We're engaged in wars all over Africa and elsewhere. He's going, well, hang on a second. I'm just doing what you've been doing. So what's the difference? Now, I don't think there's an equivalence there, but he's playing to the masses at home. He only needs to go from this cycle to the next cycle to the next cycle. That's all he has to do. There doesn't have to be a grand long-term strategy because there's nobody coming up behind him who's going to pop him off. If that happens, if somebody does come up who's a potential rival, then that's going to change the metric a bit. But until that happens, I think he's just going to keep every now and again yank the string and or chuck a quarter in the cup, and there's Biden or whoever it is doing the little dance. Does that answer your question, right? Thanks. Nikita.
When you think Ukraine is just a flipping point between the West and the East as it used to be historically and culturally?
Yeah.
Like the West also has his own sins. Like Ukraine actually grew in GDP in terms of production when it was allied to Russia, but now we're back to the West. Nothing but that. We have huge immigration. We get huge labor force, or the economy shrinking.
I think that again we've got to think of this as unless the eastwards expansion of NATO and the EU, and more the westward drive of these entities. Do we here? I can't speak for the entire Western liberals tradition. But do we want Ukraine to be democratic? Yes. Do we want Ukraine to have fundamental freedoms that we all enjoy? Yes, we do. Because I think we're all generally agreed that that's probably a good thing. Are we prepared to invade Ukraine, or sorry, to send military troops to Ukraine in support of defensive forces against a Russian invasion? I can't answer that question. I strongly suspect the answer to that is no. Largely because I think we all agree that the effect of any invasion would be catastrophic. So again, it's hard to conceive of any reason why he would want to do that. Is the West opportunist and cynical? Yeah, I'm afraid we are. And any sort of view of certainly of recent political history, the retreat from Afghanistan was disgusting. It was abhorrent. How can we claim to be the good guys? If we're prepared to storm into a country, rip the living heart out of it, and then walk away 20 years later having achieved absolutely nothing. So, we're not necessarily the good guys here. That doesn't mean that Putin's the good guy. I don't know if there are any good guys. We're all just cynical opportunists.
My question is, if there's someone like Alexei Navalny but more powerful to threaten Putin as the de facto leader of Russia, would his strategy be changing in the medium or long term?
Putin?
Yeah.
Yeah, he'd probably kill him straight away. It seems to be the way he deals with these things. It'd have to, but until such a person emerges, we're stuck in this short-term game. I can't answer that question. I'm not an expert really in internal Russian politics, but one of the reasons why Putin's been able to get away with this for so long is because he's been able to get away with it for so long. That's a really bad answer to the question, but
Yeah. I guess, yeah, we can only wonder. We can only wonder until it becomes a reality.
precisely. I mean, something I only heard the other day is that Putin never goes to Moscow. He stays outside of Moscow. He's in his own. It's not Dhaka. It's a fortress. So when Obama visited Putin, he had to drive out of Moscow to this remote compound where Putin, this autocratic enigma, is just holding court. So yeah, we've got a complete breakdown of any sort of organized government or governmental structure. It's not immediately obvious that there's any sort of system in place for the smooth transfer of power.
Yeah.
So when that point comes, as it shall at some point, well, have you seen The Death of Stalin?
Terrible, terrible disaster.
Well, The Death of Stalin.
No,
I'm not so sure about that.
in Russian affairs, it was a terrible disaster of the transfer of power from Stalin to the next leader.
Absolutely. Because again, you don't have that mechanism for a smooth transfer of power, which democracy, for its many failings, at least gives us that.
Yeah.
Great. How was that?
It's all right, sir. Did okay.
And we managed to get through without a fist fight. That's always a good thing. Right. So that's it. That's Salon at Stowe. That's exactly what I wanted it to be. And I just want to say, obviously, thanks so much to Harry, who was fantastic. Thank you, Harry. Thanks also to the measured, or to the many measured contributions from the floor. I really appreciate that. This is all about raising the level of discourse. And it doesn't have to be about politics. It could be about art. It could be about culture. It could be about anything that you guys want, as long as it's going to push the barrier, push that boundary a little bit further down the road. Just raising the level of public debate. That's all we want. And I think we had a big step forward today. So thanks to Harry again. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thank you very much and good night.
So,